This is Isiah Thomas, point guard for the 1980 Detroit Pistons. It's the NBA Finals, Game 6, the Pistons versus the Lakers. The Pistons were one win away from their first NBA title. To start the third quarter, the Lakers had a 56-48 lead. Then Isiah Thomas started taking over.
It can come off the bench. Isiah Thomas coming back in multiples in this one. Thomas comes back and hits 82-56. Thomas feels he's got a hot quarter, and who can blame him? Stripped by the Pistons. 3-on-2 break, and the layup by Isiah Thomas, who has scored 14 points. The last 14 points for the Pistons in this third.
But with less than 5 minutes left in the third quarter, Thomas rolled his ankle, and it didn't look good. He looked like he could barely walk. And if you're a Pistons fan, this is your worst nightmare, as without Isiah Thomas, your best player, it seemed unlikely that the Lakers would be beaten. But amazingly, Thomas comes back out on one knee knowing his team needed him. What followed was something so unbelievable that this game is still famous today.
3.5 remaining in this period. Thomas with a looper scores. Thomas off balance, basket counts, and a foul as he goes into the first. Thomas goes for three and hits it. What a third quarter for Isiah Thomas. He has scored 21 points here in the third to bring the Pistons all even at 76.
This is who Isiah Thomas was: a fighter, a competitor, and most of all, an incredible basketball player. In doing research, I've heard many people consider him a top 5 point guard of all time. I've also heard people say he wasn't even as good as Chris Paul. I wanted to look into Isiah Thomas's game. Why is his status as an all-time point guard contentious to some and to others seem like a no-brainer? Today, we take a deeper look into the Detroit legend, the leader of the bad boy Pistons, and analyze how good he really was. Thomas was lightning quick on the court, and he had a great handle to maximize his quickness. He kept his dribble very low to the ground, which made it hard for others to steal. His movements were very shifty, utilizing quick change of speeds and directions to get by his defenders. His drives to the basketball were controlled, and he had a good touch. He was also creative and used reverse layups and pump fakes to freeze the defenders. He also wasn't afraid to play physical and use his strength to further create space. In transition, he always looked to push the pace, and his quickness, dribbling, and great finishing ability allowed him to be a terror on the open court. He was also a good shooter with the ability to stop on a dime and pull up. In big moments, he could also make very tough shots over larger opposition. Because of the era, he wasn't really a three-point shooter, but when he wanted to, he could pull up for a transition three. One thing I noticed while watching through footage of him is that he is good at playing off the ball for a point guard. When he passes, he's not afraid to move around and relocate to better positions. He could also knock down a jump shot off a screen. In transition, if he wasn't the ball handler, he knew how to fill up the wing to get himself easy buckets. Despite his scoring, he was also an amazing playmaker and floor general. He was a willing passer and great at hitting shooters coming off screens. Even when he was driving with speed, he was able to get the ball to open teammates as he created chaos. He could spot defensive breakdowns and craft accurate passes to give his teammates easy buckets. Again, he was a terror in transition, pushing at the ball with pace and constantly making the right decision on who to give the ball to, whether that be the trailer or to the open shooter. He also had the ability to throw long lead passes if his teammates were able to run the defense. He just always looked in control no matter the situation. Several times in his career, he would average double-digit assists, and there was no doubt that his passing was one of the main reasons the Pistons were an elite team. If you know anything about the Pistons, you know that they are one of the best defensive teams of all time. He had a great defensive cast around him that allowed Isiah to worry about the offense. Still, even though he was never a defensive highlight on his team, he still played hard and averaged about 2 steals his entire career. In a team that relied on defense as much as the Pistons, one bad defender could ruin the entire scheme. But even though Isiah Thomas had a large offensive role, he didn't let himself become a liability in defense, which helped his team a lot. I think one of the things that makes Thomas such a great player player is his intangibles. He was a great leader, a great competitor, and very tough. The Bad Boy Pistons played rough, and Thomas was not afraid to get dirty if that's what his team needed. Of course, this sometimes led to controversies and bad blood with other players, but there's no denying that he gave his all for his team. Disregarding any of his stats, he has two of the most important ones in basketball. He had 2 NBA championships. He did this by being the best player on a team that faced the historic teams of the Lakers, the Celtics, and the Bulls. If you look at his stats, you would see that in the playoffs, his play improved by a wide margin, showing that when it mattered, he played his best. Earlier I mentioned that some people thought he wasn't as good as Chris Paul, but you know, interestingly enough, I feel like their games are somewhat similar. Both are what I would consider get-it-done point guards. Even though their individual skills are different, they are both point guards that will do whatever their team needs to win, whether that be facilitating with great passes or taking over a game.
23 points. And the shot is good by Thomas.
Even though Thomas had that miracle game, the Pistons would go on to lose in controversial fashion. They also lost the Game 7 against the Lakers. Even though they lost, the most memorable part of that whole series is arguably Isiah's defining Game 6 performance. Unfortunately, for as tough as Thomas was, there was a price for that toughness and his injuries started to pile up. The injuries eventually led him to retiring at the early age of 32. If there is any sort of criticism people can give about Thomas, it is that while he had a great career peak, it didn't last as long as other star guards. But still, you can't deny the fact that he was a winner. In his legacy, he left the Pistons being their all-time leader in points, steals, and assists. He led them to being a perennial contender and 2 titles. There are few players that contain an elite combination of skill, speed, IQ, and competitive toughness. Where he ranks on the list of all-time guards will probably always be up to debate. But what isn't up to debate is that Isiah Thomas was a surefire superstar and was one of the greatest point guards to ever play the game.